Hi, I'm Jason, and today I'm here to give you 10 tips to help you build better Commander decks. Number 10, try out different cards. Commander has a massive card pool to draw from, but once you've assembled 100 cards for your deck, it's easy to become complacent, never testing new cards that could prove invaluable to your strategy. Experimenting with cards is a great way to find fun, interesting, and powerful synergies and scenarios you'd never consider otherwise. Whether there's a card in your deck you're not too keen on, or just a card in your binder that you want to take for a spin, I suggest switching out at least one card from your deck every 5 to 10 games, so that you can really see the impact of the cards you're losing and the cards you're gaining. Tip number 9, increase or decrease your land count. After building the first iteration of a deck, players often swap out different spells, but leave the mana base alone, never changing the number of lands. Whatever your land count is at, try adding one land in place of a spell. See how the deck plays for a few games and see if you notice a difference. Are you getting mana screwed or flooded more often? If you're not getting flooded, then try adding another land, and so on until you feel it stops improving your deck. Players are notorious for including too few lands in their deck because it's more fun to play spells, so you need to actively fight that urge. Similarly, if you think you're more likely to have too many lands in your deck, you can take this same approach by removing one land at a time from your deck. I say this very cautiously though, because, as I said, players look for any excuse to take lands out of their deck, usually to their detriment. Just because that's the most common mindset though, doesn't mean there aren't players who have too many lands clogging up their deck. Try to evaluate where your deck sits on this spectrum before changing the number of lands. Tip number 8, lower your curve. It's true that Commander is the format where you can play really expensive spells, but people tend to include too many. It's not that you shouldn't have big splashy cards, just that you should pick and choose which are important for your deck's strategy. It's better to have no more than 5 cards costing 7 or more mana in your deck, and overall I find it best to have an average CMC, or MV, of 3 to 3.5. Tapped out and Ether Hub automatically calculate your average. Something important to remember is the most powerful turns in Commander aren't usually when you cast your one big spell, but when you cast 2 cheap spells that are very powerful. If you cast Rise of the Dark Realms and then your opponent plays a Wrath of God and a Colonian Hydra, then they spent 4 mana to counteract your 9-drop, and they had mana left over to cast a significant threat. Lowering your mana curve is the best way to ensure you have the most powerful turns. Tip number 7, add more removal. Players often neglect, or at least undervalue, single target removal, because it's seen as bad in Commander. After all, you spend 1 card to remove 1 card from another player, which essentially puts the 2 other players at the table up in card advantage. But when your opponent's Voltron or Infect Commander is swinging at you, a Path to Exile just might save your life. Players tend to include a couple obligatory removal spells, but don't take the time to properly evaluate how many they need. And in the last few years, what with the intense power creep winter we've been living in, the number of suggested removal spells has steadily increased. So consider replacing one of your 17 finishers with an Anguished Unmaking. Tip number 6, update your deck with new expansions. It's easy to build a deck, be satisfied with how it plays, and never change it again. But because new sets are releasing all the time, the card pool to draw from is ever expanding. To keep your deck the best it can be, and just to keep it fresh, you should update your deck every so often with new cards. It doesn't have to be every time a new set releases. That can certainly be exhausting. It could just be every 6 months or once a year, but it's beneficial to evaluate what new cards have been released that might improve your deck, or that could totally replace a card that has now become strictly worse. Tip number 5, try out different commanders. This tip is specifically for decks that aren't built around the commander, but rather a central theme or strategy. For example, I have a 5-color deck that's all about casting lots of spells for free, or cheaper than their cost, and getting payoffs for doing so. This means lots of cascade cards, expensive enchantments, and cards that give benefits for casting several spells. This deck idea doesn't hinge on any specific commander, so when I built the deck, I looked for a commander that would work well. I settled on Joda, Archmage Eternal, and he served me well until M20 came out and Golos, yes, I know, boring Golos, was even better for the deck. Maybe you have a Sharum the Hegemon artifact deck, but have yet to try out Sidri or Alayla as the commander. For all you know, another commander could be even better than the one you're running, or it could just be a nice change of pace for a few games. Tip number 4, veer away from staples. This tip isn't just to add variety and uniqueness to your decks. A staple is by definition a card that is generically good in all or most decks, which means it won't often have synergies with your themes. You should do your best to replace staples with cards that have similar effects but synergize better with the rest of your deck. I have an Ashai and Rayhan partner deck focused on building up a large number of +1/+1 counters and never losing them because of Rayhan's ability to move them when a creature dies. Cultivate is a great ramp card, but in this deck, Fertilid has more synergy, allowing you to turn those +1/+1 counters into more than just 2 lands. And since Rayhan needs at least 1 creature to move counters onto, all of my board wipes leave a creature behind. Instead of Wrath of God and Damnation, I use Divine Reckoning and Dune Blast to ensure I don't lose those counters. There's nothing wrong with including a couple staples in your deck, but you should look for cards that fill the same role while strengthening the core principles of your deck. Tip number 3, identify deck weaknesses and mitigate them. There's 2 levels to this tip. The first level is fairly straightforward. In a white deck, make sure to include card draw and ramp spells. In a blue deck, find ways to remove artifacts, creatures, and enchantments permanently, like Curse of the Swine, Pongify, Ravenform, and cheap counterspells like Swansong. In black, removing artifacts and enchantments is a weakness. Feed the Swarm and Phyrexian Tribute, I guess, are good for that. For red, destroying enchantments is a pain, so Chaos Warp is really good there. And green, well, green doesn't have any weaknesses. And for the Grixis colors that can't deal with certain permanents I just mentioned, Meteor Golem and Unstable Obelisk can be good too. But the second level of this tip is more of an evaluation of your deck as a whole, not just its colors. If your deck is really slow and controlling, then its weakness would probably be aggro decks or quick ramp decks, so you'll need cards to counteract those archetypes, maybe Ghostly Prison or Confounded Conundrum. If your deck is aggro or quick ramp, you'll need to not run out of gas. That probably means including additional card draw or graveyard recursion spells. Or you could have a commander like Mariki Rebarrett, something, who is really good at removing big threats, but is poor at crowd control. In that case, maybe you need to add a couple more board wipes to your deck. Whatever your weaknesses are, identify them and do your best to counteract them. Tip number 2, include subthemes. Your commander often sets the main theme of your deck, but that doesn't have to be the only theme. Subthemes can add depth, complexity, and replayability to your decks, as well as offering you multiple avenues to winning the game, which makes it more resilient to your opponents trying to stop you. I had a Tetsuko Umezawa deck, and the main goal was to have a bunch of unblockable 1 power or toughness creatures to beat down my opponents slowly. But it turns out many powerful blue creatures with 1 power or toughness have artifact synergies, so I ended up incorporating an artifact subtheme. This improved the deck's cohesion because there are now multiple aspects of each card that work well with other cards. Subthemes make decks better, more fun, and they help a lot with tip number 1, which is don't bet everything on your commander. Your commander is a crucial component to your deck, no doubt about it, and being able to cast it again and again makes players think it's okay to place all responsibility of winning on the commander. Every card in the deck is made to work specifically with the commander, and without the commander, the deck falls flat. There are many issues with this style of deck building. As soon as people learn that your deck is inoperable without your commander, they'll make sure to kill it every time. Also, spending every other turn casting your commander and hoping it'll stick is likely to leave you really far behind on board. One of the most common things I see like this is including a random instant or sorcery that's frankly terrible, but happens to have synergies with your commander. This could be an untap spell with Mariki, or a random token maker in a Teysa Karlov deck. Each card needs to have a high impact and needs to be worth playing whether your commander is on the field or not. I'm not saying you can't have a few cards that are better with your commander or even really, really good, but no card should be a total dud just because your commander is on the sidelines. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out some of our other videos. We have comedy videos, deck techs, custom card design videos, and many more. And don't forget to subscribe. Thanks again.